Welcome back to Tell Me More Stories Told as Podcast, where we kind of take everyday objects and we uncover their hidden stories.
Yeah.
Today, we're setting the table for a deep dive into something you probably use every day without a second thought, the fork.
Oh, yeah. You know, it's funny how something so simple can have such a long and fascinating history.
Right. I mean, I never really thought about where forks came from
Right.
or how they evolved, but I have a feeling we're in for some surprises today.
Absolutely. Let's start by shattering a common misconception. Many people assume forks are a relatively modern invention, but the truth is, they've been around for millennia.
Really. Millennia. So we're talking way before the internet, way before electricity.
Way before archaeological evidence points to bone forks being used in China as far back as the Bronze Age. That's around 2400 to 1900 BC. Imagine that. People are using forks to eat almost 4,000 years ago.
Wow, that's incredible. So China was an early adopter of fork technology, so to speak. What about other parts of the world?
Well, we know that large forks were used in ancient Egypt, primarily for cooking and serving. So even back then, the fork had a place in the kitchen, though not yet at the dining table.
Interesting. So it seems like the fork's journey from kitchen tool to an essential eating utensil is a slow evolution.
Precisely. And to understand that evolution, we need to travel to the Roman Empire. The Romans used bronze and silver forks, many of which are still preserved in museums today.
So they had the craftsmanship to make these intricate forks.
They did, but there's a twist. The Romans mainly used their forks for cooking and serving, not for individual dining. It wasn't yet the personal fork we know and love today.
So close, yet so far. When does that shift happen? When does the fork finally make it to the dinner table?
That's where it gets really interesting. The personal table fork, as we know it, likely originated in the Eastern Roman, or Byzantine Empire. And get this, they were commonly used there by the 4th century.
Wow. The Byzantines were ahead of the curve. So they were casually using forks while the rest of the world was still using their hands.
Pretty much. And this difference in dining customs becomes strikingly apparent. In a story about a Byzantine princess named Theophanu,
Okay, I love a good royal story. Tell me more.
picture this. It's the 10th century, and Princess Theophanu marries the Holy Roman Emperor Otto II. She travels from Constantinople to the west, bringing her Byzantine customs with her. Now imagine the scene at a grand banquet. Everyone's gathered, the food is being served, and Theophanu starts eating with a fork.
Wait, so she's at this fancy banquet with all these important people,
Yeah,
and she's the only one using a fork. I can only imagine the looks on their faces.
I'm sure there were some raised eyebrows, and maybe even a few dropped jaws, to the Westerners, who were still accustomed to eating with their hands. It must have seemed incredibly strange, perhaps even a bit uncivilized.
It's amazing how something we take for granted today could have been seen as so outlandish back then. It really makes you think about how our ideas of etiquette and what's proper have evolved over time.
It really does. Now, if you're enjoying this deep dive into the history of the fork, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our fascinating stories on Tell Me More.
Yes, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on our next adventure. But back to Theophano. It sounds like she inadvertently sparked a fork revolution.
She might have planted the seed, but the fork's journey in the West was far from smooth sailing. You see, while the Byzantine Empire embraced the fork, it took a much longer time for it to catch on in other parts of the world.
So what happened next? Did the fork fade into obscurity? Or did it eventually find its way onto more Western tables?
Well, the fork didn't disappear entirely. In fact, we have evidence that by the 9th century, a similar utensil called a bargin was being used in Persia, though only among the elite. By the 10th century, table forks were quite common in the Middle East, demonstrating how these cultural practices spread.
That's really interesting. So the fork had a presence in different parts of the world, but its popularity wasn't universal. What were some of the factors that influenced its adoption, or lack thereof, in various cultures?
That's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of how social norms, and even technology, can be influenced by a complex interplay of factors. But before we delve into that, let's shift our focus back to Europe and explore the challenges the fork faced in gaining wider acceptance.
Okay, let's unpack this European fork drama.
Well, as you might imagine, the fork's popularity spread much more slowly in Northern Europe compared to its relatively early adoption in the Byzantine Empire.
I'm sensing some resistance. Was it just a matter of people being stuck in their ways? Or were there other reasons why the fork faced such an uphill battle in the West?
There were definitely some strong opinions about this newfangled utensil. In the early 17th century, an English traveler named Thomas Coriat wrote about his travels in Italy, where he encountered forks for the first time.
Because he was like, whoa, check out this cool thing they're using to eat here.
Exactly. He brought the idea back to England, but unfortunately for him, the English weren't quite as impressed. They saw the fork as a strange, and get this, unmanly Italian affectation.
Unmanly. Seriously. It's just a utensil. What could be unmanly about using a fork?
It seems absurd to us now, right? But back then, table manners and etiquette were deeply ingrained in society. You have to remember that this was a time when people primarily ate with their hands.
I guess it's hard to imagine a world without forks now. We use them for everything. But it sounds like the fork was a real disruptor to the established social norms of the time.
Precisely. It wasn't just a matter of practicality. It was about challenging deeply held beliefs about how people should behave at the table. And those beliefs were pretty resistant to change.
So it sounds like the fork was facing an uphill battle, not just against practicality, but against deeply ingrained cultural perceptions as well.
Exactly. But the story doesn't end there. There were other forces at play that influenced the fork's fate.
Oh, I'm intrigued. What other obstacles did the fork have to overcome?
Believe it or not, even the church had something to say about the use of forks.
Wait, the church? Why would they care about forks?
Well, this is where we see how something as seemingly mundane as a fork can become intertwined with religious beliefs. Some within the Roman Catholic Church saw the fork as a sign of excessive delicacy and luxury, which they believed went against the values of simplicity and humility that were so central to their faith.
That's fascinating. So the fork was caught in a cultural tug-of-war between practicality and tradition, with a sprinkle of religious debate thrown in for good measure. It must have been a wild ride for this little utensil.
It certainly was, and we're just getting started.
Okay, I'm hooked. I can't wait to hear what happens next in the fork's incredible journey.
Welcome back to Tell Me More Stories Told As podcast. Before we left off, we were discussing how the fork was entangled in this complex web of social customs and even religious beliefs.
It's incredible how much history and cultural significance is packed into this little utensil that we use every day.
It really is. And speaking of cultural significance, there's another fascinating chapter in the fork's story that I think you'll find interesting. It's a story of how the fork went from being seen as unmanly to becoming a symbol of status and sophistication.
Okay, now that's a plot twist I didn't see coming. How did that happen?
Well, as we talked about earlier, the fork's journey in the West was slow, but it eventually started to gain traction, particularly in Italy. And this is where the pasta connection comes in.
Ah, pasta. I knew there had to be a food connection somewhere in this story.
Exactly. As pasta dishes became increasingly popular in Italy, the fork proved to be the perfect tool for twirling those slippery noodles. It was simply more practical and less messy than using your hands or a spoon.
That makes perfect sense. I can't imagine trying to eat spaghetti with just a spoon. It would be a disaster.
It would be a culinary catastrophe. And as pasta spread throughout Europe, so did the fork. It became associated with Italian cuisine, which was becoming increasingly fashionable and sought after in elite circles.
So the fork was riding the pasta wave of popularity.
Exactly. It became a symbol of refinement and sophistication, particularly in Italian court culture. And what's even more interesting is that it reached a point where guests would bring their own forks to banquets in special boxes called cadenas.
Wow. Bringing your own fork to a dinner party? That's like showing up with your own set of designer chopsticks today. It's a statement piece, a status symbol.
Precisely. The fork was no longer just a utensil. It was a way to showcase your wealth, taste, and social standing. Imagine that. Something that was once considered strange and unmanly became a coveted object of desire.
It's a real Cinderella story for the fork, isn't it? From being shunned to being the star of the show.
You could say that, but even as the fork gained acceptance in some parts of Europe, it still faced pockets of resistance in others. Old habits die hard, and some people simply couldn't let go of their traditional ways.
I guess it's understandable. Change can be hard, especially when it comes to something as ingrained as eating habits.
Absolutely. Some people just found the fork awkward and unnecessary. They argued, why do we need this fancy new tool when we have perfectly good hands? They were comfortable with their existing customs and didn't see a reason to change.
I guess it takes time for new ideas to take root, especially when they challenge long-held beliefs and practices.
It does. And let's not forget the religious objections we mentioned earlier. Some within the Roman Catholic Church continued to view the fork with suspicion, seeing it as a sign of excessive indulgence and a departure from the values of simplicity and humility.
It's fascinating how a simple eating utensil could become a lightning rod, For such diverse opinions and beliefs, it's a testament to how deeply our cultural values shape our everyday lives.
It really is. And the fork story is a reminder that even seemingly insignificant objects can reflect broader social, cultural, and even religious trends.
It's like holding a tiny mirror up to history and seeing all these complex forces reflected back at us.
Exactly. And speaking of reflections, I think it's time we take a step back and marvel at the sheer variety of forks we have today. It's a far cry from those basic two-pronged bone forks our ancestors used.
Oh, absolutely. We've come a long way from those early prototypes. Today, we have a fork for practically every occasion and every type of food imaginable.
You're absolutely right. Let's start with the basics. We have the trusty dinner fork, the salad fork, and the dainty dessert fork. These are the usual suspects you'll find in most formal table settings.
Right. But then there's a whole world of specialized forks that most people probably don't even know exist. It's like a secret society of forks.
I love that analogy. Yes, there are some real gems hidden within the world of forks. For seafood enthusiasts, we have the ingenious crab fork, perfectly designed to help you extract that delicious crab meat from those hard-to-reach crevices.
And for those who appreciate a touch of elegance with their afternoon tea, there's the delicate lemon fork. It's specially crafted for serving lemon slices, so you can avoid getting sticky fingers.
And of course, we can't forget the pickle fork, a dedicated tool for those who, like myself, can't resist the crunchy, tangy goodness of a pickle.
Okay, I have to admit, I'm a huge fan of the pickle fork. It just feels right to have a designated utensil for those precious pickles. It's like they've earned their own special place at the table.
I completely agree. It's a testament to the enduring power of the fork, how it has evolved to meet our specific culinary needs and preferences.
But it's not just about the variety. It's also about how the concept of the fork itself has continued to evolve. We've seen the emergence of hybrid utensils, like this fork, which cleverly combines the features of a spoon and a fork.
And then there's the sporf, which takes it a step further by adding a knife edge to the mix. It's like the Swiss Army knife of eating utensils.
It's amazing how this seemingly simple tool continues to adapt and innovate to meet our ever-changing needs,
Yeah,
and it makes you wonder what the future holds for the fork.
that's a great question. Will we see even more specialized designs? Will technology revolutionize the way we use forks? The possibilities are endless.
I can't wait to see what the future holds for this ubiquitous utensil. But for now, let's take a moment to appreciate how far the fork has come.
From ancient origins to modern marvels, the fork has truly made its mark on the world.
And on that note, we'll be back in just a moment to wrap up our exploration of this amazing utensil. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Tell Me More Stories Told as podcast. We've been on quite a journey today, tracing the evolution of the fork, from its humble beginnings to its modern-day diversity.
It's amazing how such a seemingly simple object can have such a rich and complex history, reflecting broader changes in society, culture, and even technology.
Absolutely. And speaking of technology, I'm curious about what the future holds for the fork. Any predictions on what the fork of tomorrow might look like?
That's a fascinating question. It's always tricky to predict the future, but I think we can look at current trends for some clues. For example, the rise of 3D printing could open up some really exciting possibilities for creating custom forks with unique designs and functions tailored to specific needs.
Oh, I love that idea. Imagine being able to design your own fork, perfectly suited to your hand, your eating style, and even your favorite foods.
Exactly. You could have a fork with a longer handle for reaching into deep bowls, or a fork with a wider tine spacing for spearing chunky vegetables. The possibilities are endless.
That would be amazing. And as technology continues to advance, I wonder if we might even see forks integrated with sensors or smart features.
Now that's an intriguing thought. We're already seeing this trend with other everyday objects, so why not forks? Imagine a fork that could analyze the nutritional content of your food, or track your eating habits, providing real-time feedback on your diet and helping you make healthier choices.
Wow. A fork that acts as your personal nutritionist. That's both futuristic and a little bit intimidating, if I'm being honest.
I understand that sentiment. It does raise some interesting questions about privacy and data security. As with any new technology, we need to think carefully about the ethical implications and ensure that these innovations are used responsibly.
That's a crucial point. It's exciting to think about the possibilities, but we also need to be mindful of the potential downsides and unintended consequences.
Absolutely. But regardless of what the future holds, I think it's safe to say that the fork, in some form or another, will continue to be an essential part of our dining experience.
I completely agree. It's hard to imagine a world without forks. It's a tool that has transcended cultures and centuries, connecting us to our past
Mhm.
and reminding us of how much ingenuity and creativity goes into even the most everyday objects.
So true. And who knows, maybe one day in the future, your fork will be a museum artifact, telling its own story of how it was used and how it evolved alongside humanity.
That's a wonderful thought. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the incredible world of forks.
Thank you for joining us on this fascinating exploration.
We hope you've enjoyed learning about the fork's rich history, its cultural significance, and its endless potential for innovation.
And we hope you'll join us next time on Tell Me More Stories Told as podcast for another intriguing journey into the stories behind everyday things.
Until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking. Tell me more.